On behalf of the Institute, I'd like to welcome you to NYUAD, and at the same time, I'd like to thank the Institute for making this evening possible. My name is Justin Stearns. I'm Assistant Professor of Arab Crossroads Studies here at NYU, and we're still working on the nomenclature, but I run or direct or head or I'm a point person for the Arab Crossroads Studies program in major. It is really a deep pleasure this evening to be able to welcome Sherine Hamdy, both professionally and personally. For us, and maybe to some extent for Sherine, it's a homecoming very far away from home. She got her PhD back from NYU in the Department of Anthropology in 2006. And the research that she will be talking about this evening, which ultimately led to her book, Our Bodies Belong to God, Organ Transplants, Islam, and the Struggle for Human Dignity in Egypt, which came out last year, was based on 2 years of fieldwork in Egypt, in Tanta, Mansoura, and Cairo. She has been a professor of anthropology at Brown since 2008, and was a Mellon postdoctoral fellow before that at Brown's Kogut Center for the Humanities from 2006 to 2008. She serves on the Faculty Committee of Science, Technology, and Society, and on the Faculty Committee of Middle East Studies. And in 2009, she was named the Kutayba Alghanim Assistant Professor for the Social Sciences. Having had the chance to teach her book and parts of it and to lead students through discussing it here at NYUAD, I can testify to the fact that it is, shall we say, stimulating, and to say the least, and I'll let you be the judges of that later on. At the moment, though, to speak for a moment about her future work, she has two projects. One of them has to do with work I will tentatively dub it Doctors of the Revolution, looking at Egypt again. And second, another project, and perhaps of more direct immediate relevance to us here in the Gulf, is one on consanguinity, a comparative project looking at the Gulf, England, and Egypt. On a personal note, it's wonderful to have Sherine here this evening simply because she is an old friend, and a long time ago now, I guess seemingly too long ago, 12 years ago, I had the good fortune to spend a year with her in Cairo, back when I was still trying to begin to learn Arabic. So I would like to welcome here this evening, and I hope you can all join me.
So thank you so much, all of you, for coming tonight. I know it was difficult to get here. I'm really honored to be here. I really enjoyed the warm welcome I've received so far. And I'm especially happy to share this work with you. It's something I spent more than 10 years working on. So now that it's out, I'd like to know that there's some kind of use in the world for all of that very hard work I put into. I'm going to be talking about my book, and this is the cover illustration of the book that came out last March. And what I do in this book is I take organ transplantation almost as if it's a window to allow me to look at Egyptian society, and particularly about contestations between religious and medical authority. How do we get to decide what is good medical practice? How do we know that this is in accordance with our deeply held and cherished religious beliefs? Who gets to decide, and at whose cost? These were the questions that I was really interested in. And it just so happens that right now we're looking at a period of a lot of flux and change, where medical authority is more than ever contested. Patients feel more empowered to ask questions, to maybe criticize physicians, to have alternative explanations for illnesses. And similarly, religious texts are much more accessible now than they have been in history, and people contest the authority on what authority are you speaking in the name of Islam. So these are not easy answers. It's not like we have a very clear-cut scriptural text that will tell us what to do with the new medical technology. And the medical technology itself is very complex, and it's changing all the time. So that's something I'll say a little bit more about. So really, organ transplantation for me was an ideal site to analyze larger questions about the role of Islam in public policy, about the unprecedented concentration of wealth in the hands of a few, This is a worldwide phenomenon. The widening gap between rich and poor, the withdrawal of state services in the context of Egypt and other countries that are undergoing neoliberal reform, and a wide discontent with governance that was very palpable even in these years. So my fieldwork took place 2002 to 2004. January 25, 2011 didn't come out of nowhere. There was already large discontent that was very palpable. So at the center of the book, I start out with a number of puzzles. And it's my aim to offer an anthropological understanding. And my argument is that you have to really live with people. You have to hear from the voices of all of those whose lives are at stake in these questions to really understand what's going on here. So these things might look like puzzles, but with in-depth social science research, we can start to tease them apart. So the first puzzle is that Egypt, in terms of the Muslim Arab region, was a pioneer in organ transplantation. It's the first country in the world to have the first kidney transplant, which was in 1976 in Mansoura, at the hands of a very renowned surgeon called Mohammed Ghanem. And yet, it was, in its own words, lagging behind. Other countries in the region that started much later, like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iran, began transplant programs, and Egypt for more than 30 years had legislative obstacles, debates, big impediments to organ transplantation. So what accounts for this? The second puzzle is that what was the position on Islam? So the religious authorities, the state-appointed religious authorities, which were Sheikh al-Azhar or the Mufti of the Republic of Dar al-Ifta, all of the people in the religious official positions said that when the benefit is clear, if you're saving the life of a patient, then the benefit outweighs the harm that would be cutting into a dead person, or it would, if the benefit outweighs the harm done to a living person, if it's in the clear health benefit, then yubih, there's no problem in Islam, it would be halal. And yet, when you talk to many people on the streets, when you talk to patients, and you talk to physicians, and even transplant surgeons, you find that people have religious reservations. They would often use the word, our bodies belong to God. So who am I to take it, to cut it, to sell it, to exchange it? So where does religious authority lie? The other puzzle was that even those parties who would presumably benefit, so it's not just from the outside, somebody who's looking down at it and not involved. No, even patients whose lives could be saved or lengthened by kidney transplantation will often refuse offers from relatives to donate their kidneys. Even, and this was a big surprise to me, I would find transplant surgeons whose practice was, they were profiting from transplantation, and they felt that deep inside there was something not right about it, something haram, something uneasy, even though that they were benefiting from the procedure. Now, another puzzle is that I didn't only study kidney transplantation, I also looked at liver lobe transplants, which happened in Egypt since the late 80s, and also the transplantation of the cornea, which happens, it can happen within 6 hours after death. And Egyptians, again, were pioneers medically in this field. The first cornea transplants were in the late 50s, early 60s, and yet at the time of my field research, all of the eye banks were shut down. And the discourse, if you look at the discourse about cornea transplantation versus kidney transplantation, you find a big difference. Even though people are saying, well, the body belongs to God, it doesn't, it actually looks very different depending on which body part. So people who were in need of cornea transplants were all very upset that there was no cornea transplant available. Every patient who was in need of a cornea transplant desperately wanted one to be able to see again, yet that was not the case with kidney transplants. So why is it that depending on the body part, we hear very different things? And the final puzzle was that when I would ask people about their opinions about organ transplantation, one of the few things that people agreed about was that it's haram to buy or to exploit from a poor seller. If somebody's very desperate and he just wants to make money, he's in debt, he's trying to avoid prison in debt, and he wants to sell his kidney, haram to take advantage of him and to buy. Selling, people didn't like the idea of selling. And yet, more than 75, and some estimates 90% of kidney transplants in Egypt happen in that precise way. And there is more broadly a global, vibrant global trade in organs. And this is something that happens in every country of the world, including the United States. It happens in countries that have explicitly criminalized the selling and buying of kidneys. It's a fact that there will never be enough kidneys in the world for all of the people in need. And kidney transplantation has been described by people as a victim of its own success. And what they mean by that is that if in the very beginning transplant surgeons had imagined that it was relatively a strange occurrence that you would find somebody in this desperate state of kidney failure and a kidney replacement could save that person's life. And yet with the success of transplantation, it became more and more common in the medical field to rely on transplantation for more and more diseases. So the pool of people who might potentially benefit from transplants gets larger and larger and larger, particularly as transplantation advances. And yet the supply will always be limited. So in some people's analysis, this is the capitalist dream. You have unending demand and limited supply. So at the center of the question is, what was this impediment? What was blocking, or what is blocking? Even today in Egypt, there's not an implemented national organ transplantation. So a lot of people, and this particularly happened in the state press, would blame religious authorities. And the one that they picked on particularly, can I just ask, because I'm curious, how many people know Sheikh al-Sha'rawi or have seen him? Okay, so he's a very, very famous television preacher in Egypt. And he was caught off guard in 1988. He was a guest on a television show, and somebody asked him, "Ya Sheikh, what do you think about kidney transplantation?" And he said, "How can you give something that doesn't belong to you? That doesn't make sense. The body belongs to God." Now, this caused a huge stir in the newspaper reading public in Egypt. People were very angry. They said, why would he put an impediment to something that already hasn't happened yet? This could save people's lives. Haram, all the poor people in kidney transplant, he's not feeling for them. What I found, and the assumption was that because he said this, now people are going to follow him blindly and go against their own interests and don't want kidney transplantation because they heard this guy say that. And my research shows that's not the case at all. People would often refer to the words of Sheikh Sha'rawi. He is very revered in Egypt, but not because they were blindly following him, not because they were duped, not because they were going against their own interests, but because he had touched on something that was able to encapsulate these much larger reservations that people had about organ transplantation. Now, if we look at the statement, the body belongs to God, it's a very vague, it doesn't really mean very much for a Muslim. It's common sense, right? Of course, Allah created everything in the earth and the heavens. Of course, Allah is our creator. Of course, the body belongs to God. But how does that statement have anything to do with whether you transplant? It doesn't really have a direct relevance, right? And it doesn't tell us, okay, why is transplantation a problem, but not blood donation? What about the replacement of the kidney function by the dialysis machine? What about, it makes this such a blanket statement, very vague. It makes it seem as if Muslims are fatalists and they don't want any artificial or technological intervention with God's plan. Well, this isn't the case at all, because we find that people are on dialysis. And I even spoke with a woman, and I remember this case very well because she made me realize, she said to me, when I said, what about kidney transplantation? She had a very difficult life. Her husband had divorced her because the dialysis treatment was too expensive. She was unable to produce a son. She had a daughter, and he divorced her, so now she has to take care of her daughter and pay the debt. It was a very, very difficult story. And I asked her, well, do you consider kidney transplantation? And she said, no, the body belongs to God. As if, khalas. But she said, but the thing that keeps me going every morning to wake up and gets me here in this difficult dialysis unit is the hope that one day the doctors will discover a way to clone kidney cells. And that way I will be cured without having to cut into or bother or take somebody else. So this was really surprising to me because I had just come from the United States, and it was still George Bush in those days, and there was a big no-no about stem cells. And this woman was hoping. That was what brought her to the dialysis clinic. So there's different ethical reservations. We can't take it to be that it's some kind of technophobia or some kind of fatalistic acceptance of God's will. There's something very specific about organ transplantation that's bothering people. And so I want to know, what is it? I'm not satisfied with what I'm getting in the newspapers. What I'm getting in the newspapers is saying, Islam says this. Well, Islam didn't say this. They're saying Sheikh Sharawi. Well, people aren't doing this because of Sheikh Sharawi. What's going on here? That's what I want to know. So the other thing to think about is in the Euro-American context, again, organ transplantation is often associated with this miraculous gift of life. You're recycling the organs of one person, you're enabling the rebirth of another. There's lots of imagery. And Euro-American anthropologists who studied Euro-American context for transplantation, they said, one of them said something very funny. I like to cite him, Don Jereleman. He said, just like the body needs pharmaceutical immunosuppressants to not reject the foreign organ, so does culture need cultural immunosuppression to not reject this idea that you can cut into somebody else's body and not violate a sense of self and other and restore this notion of personhood. And so there was a very large, elaborate rhetorical performance that was put on in the Euro-American context. The medical community had much tighter, ironically, control over the bioethics discourse in the public. And we get this idea of miracles, this green imagery, the recycling, the gifting, the rebirth. Many people have talked about the Christian imagery that comes with Jesus and the crucifix, other people living because of his sacrifice, and that imagery plays in very well with the imagery of organ transplantation. Someone else's death and sacrifice enables the salvation on this earth of somebody else. That's one discourse. And then in Egypt, what was the discourse was about exploitation, livers and kidneys. This is a journalist from Al Ahram newspaper, writes this report addressed to the President of the Republic, was Mubarak at the time, saying, look at what's happened. Egyptians have been reduced to their livers and kidneys, cut up like animals to be sold. This is what the citizen has come to. It was seen as humiliation. The Egyptian citizen is reduced to something that could be cut up and sold and exploited in this capitalist world economy where the Egyptians are getting the shorter end of the deal. There are these structural adjustment programs that are supposed to promise economic development, and what we see is that the wealthy are getting wealthier and the poor are constantly getting the shorter end of the deal. And this is exacerbated with a biotechnology like organ transplantation. It's not fixing the health problem, it's exacerbating the health problem by deepening the divide between the rich and the poor. We also saw in Egyptian popular culture, this was a very famous movie that came out in 1989 with Noor Sharif, the actor, and he was a victim of a kidney theft. Then the rich guy here, that rich man, was the owner of a touristic hospital business, and when he found out that this guy has his blood type, he tricks him and says you need an appendicitis and steals a kidney. So this idea of kidney theft was very vibrant and in the imagination, and it spoke to a vulnerability that Egyptians were feeling. This is before there was a political awakening, where there was political language that was able to critique the governance and the management of resources. And so what people drew on was imagery and metaphors. And this was one of them, that our bodies are just mere parts that can be bought and sold. Okay, so when we talk about legislation, in 1976, when Mohammed Ghunaim did the first kidney transplant in Mansoura in Egypt, immediately transplant surgeons wanted legislation. They didn't, and what's very interesting about kidney transplant, I'll just say, is that the medical ethical premise, do no harm, has to be violated for a live donor, because there's a living, healthy donor, and now the physician is intervening in that donor to do a very risky operation to extract a vital organ. Okay, if we go back to 1954, when the first such living kidney transplant took place in Peter Bent Hospital in Boston, it's very interesting. It happened between two identical twins. And the surgeon at the time, and they had to be identical because they didn't yet develop immunosuppressants. So the organ was genetically identical, and that's why the twin brother didn't reject it. At the time, the surgeons were very concerned about the living donor. They were very concerned about this principle of violating do no harm. And what they said was, these were identical twin brothers. They were very tight, they were very close. And he said, the psychological benefit of him knowing that he saved his brother's life will outweigh the medical risk. Okay, now however problematic that might be, how do we decide who's psychologically benefiting? At least that was the understanding, was that there was medical risk. As transplantation expanded and traveled all over the world and globalized, we get less and less people concerned about the risk to living donor. It becomes this commonsensical thing, well, there's no harm to donor. A person can live with one kidney. A person can live with 1/4 a kidney. But what are the conditions under which you got to having only one kidney? What were the dietary conditions? What are the lifestyle conditions? What are the medical procedures? What about the sterility, the anesthesia, the surgical techniques? There's a lot of factors that go into the potential for somebody's psychological benefit to outweigh the medical risk. So in 1954, these were concerns. They continued. And the bioethicists and surgeons agreed at the time, well, we'll circumvent this whole problem if we can start to just rely on cadaveric procurement. Okay, so what's the problem? They're experimenting with cadaveric procurement, and they find out, well, if somebody's been dead for a while, the organs don't do very well, right, in the recipient. So what you really need is somebody whose body is still living, in a sense, biologically intact, but their neurological function has ceased completely. So the first such operation was in Cape Town in South Africa. It was a heart surgeon who took the heart from a car accident victim. And we find that most of such donors are actually car accident victims. They have to have massive head trauma or gunshot wounds. It could also be homicide and suicide. These are the normal recipients that are taken in the US context. So what's actually surprising is that in Europe, Western Europe and North America, the public doesn't have reservations with this issue. The physicians sort of redefine what death can mean. In 1968, there's an ad hoc committee at Harvard, and they say, well, right now, legally, somebody's heart and lungs have to stop working for them to be dead. But if we are going to take an organ from someone whose heart and lungs are still artificially working because they're on a respirator, but their brains have stopped functioning, we have to legally change the definition of death. Otherwise, we doctors will be accused of murder. And in the early cases in the US, this did in fact happen, where there were contestations. Did the doctor actually murder the patient? So they had to, it was very important that they solidify this in law. So basically what happened was that death was redefined now. There are two ways to die. The way that 99% of the population will die, which is that the lungs and heart stop, or 1% of people, probably in the world, might die where their brain endures massive trauma, their bodies are resuscitated on a respirator, and their organs can be used. So again, in the Euro-American context, we have a lot of cultural imagery about the salvific nature, where this death, because it's usually so sudden and traumatic, it's a car accident, it wasn't somebody sick that you were expecting kind of going downhill. People who are generally very healthy, because their organs have to be used, suddenly are in this traumatic case that ends their life. And the families are feeling so shocked, and what the transplant coordinators encourage them to kind of come up with a framework of meaning, to make this death meaningful, to make this death worth something, to make it enable the life of somebody else. That was very comforting for a lot of families. And anthropologists who have studied this case find that indeed many families, one of the first reasons to agree to donating is because they find this kind of psychic relief that something will move on. But not every country responded in the same way to these technological changes. So Japan, notoriously, Japan is a very technologically advanced society. We can't call them technologically backward the way other people were called technologically backward. But in Japan, surgeons had a very hard time accepting that this person who was on the respirator, who looked warm, whose heart, albeit artificially, was still being pumped, whose lungs, there was still breath, they would see this person as dying. And it was very difficult to for them to come to terms with the idea of opening them up and recycling the parts in this anonymous way that was being done in Euro-America, because in Asian society, gift exchange is very important, and knowing where the gift came from and being able to reciprocate the gift is very important. So this idea that anonymously you should be able to give something and that somebody else somewhere will benefit and you'll never know how or who or why is very disconcerting. So we find that in many countries of the world, it was not accepted at all. Now, what happened in Egypt? In Egypt, it was very interesting because they had to figure out what is death. So if we want to look at, okay, what was the religious position? Well, the religious scholars didn't study neurology, right, and kidney function and all of these transplant terminology, so they have to rely on what they're told by the doctors. So depending, and there was a study done that showed exactly this, depending on the information that the religious scholars received from the physician would influence the way the Mufti understood the problem. So if they said, this person is dead, can somebody's life be recycled? Then they would say, yeah, because the haram of that is cutting into the desecration of a dead person is a harm that is smaller than the harm of letting this person die. Okay, that's how it was reasoned. But if you tell somebody their heart and lung are still beating, actually, Euro-Americans just reinvented this death thing in 1968. We don't have a legal precedent to it. They're doing this just because it's going to promote transplantation. It's a very profitable enterprise. Is that okay to take it while they're dying? And they say, no. Okay. So what happened was that this is why we got different views. At the same time, the media was saying, look at these religious scholars, they don't know what they're talking about. One says yes, one says no, why can't they make up their mind? And the religious scholars say, you're the ones who can't make up your mind. Some of the doctors are telling us that these people are alive. Some doctors are telling them that they're dead. You're the ones who are confusing us. This is your medical problem, figure it out. This was part of the legislative obstacle that took place in Egypt. This was legislatively what held up the proposals from being passed. Now, the physicians, the patients, the people on the street, it wasn't like in Japan where they were really following this case. What they were more concerned with was the commodification and the selling and the global trade. That was more on people's mind, but this was going on in the background. And I have here a road post in Cairo on the Tariq al-Zara'i. There is one of the 99 names of Allah on every signpost. This one is Al-Haq, and I thought, oh, how apt, because it shows us the place where most of the cadaveric organs would come from, the highways. They are automobile accidents. And what is the truth? What is the haq of brain death? Is this person dead? Is this person not dead? This was going back and forth. And I would meet medical residents who in their training in Cairo would come out very confused. They would say, and this is even aside from the issue of transplantation. They would say, we're in the ICU, and somebody's on a respirator, and then his heart stops. And they're looking at him, and they don't know what to do. They're frozen. And the attending says, Haram alaik, you're letting him die. Resuscitate, resuscitate. So he starts resuscitating. And the other attending comes and says, Haram alaik, he's trying to die. What are you doing? Let him die. And then he stops, and he's left not knowing what to do. This is a very complicated issue. Death, it turns out, is a complicated biological process. It's socially and emotionally a very fraught process. So the idea of coming up with 1 second to define what is death, when death actually happens in a complex way, different parts of the body die at different, it's not this 1 second thing. It was very difficult. The law demanded it to be this 1 second thing because it had certain expectations. The clinical reality was different. Okay. Now the problem that I have here is that there was a small group of physicians in Cairo who exploited this rhetoric of civilizational clash. This is at the height now of Abu Ghraib and Iraq and Afghanistan and after 9/11, and we have this Islam versus the West, and they'd say, well, they in the West, they don't care. They're so secular, they just want to recycle and treat the human being like it's a cockroach, like it's a spare part. We in Islam, we care about the soul and the status of the human being. And that's not a very helpful framework. It's a framework that kept driving the machinery that stopped the legislative. But in fact, you find that in Euro-America, you have the exact same concerns. In Germany, there was a very big debate about the problem of brain death, where physicians were very concerned about this very issue. And the Germans, even they have a very nice folk tale that the physicians would bring up to say there's something problematic about this brain death notion. And their folk tale goes, there was a smart wolf who went to the king of the sheep. And he said, I'm really hungry, but I promise I won't eat you all. If you just let me hang out with you and one of you dies, then I'll eat you. And the king of the sheep was wise, and he said, no, wolf, because a hungry wolf will start to see the sick ones as already dead. And if you're very hungry, you'll start to see the healthy ones as sick. So this notion of a slippery slope was something very concerning to people everywhere where cadaveric procurement was happening. They were worried, what if, okay, now you think people with complete brain death, irreversible brain death are dead. What if the brain stem only? Or what if, the upper brain only and not the brain stem? What if someone's in a persistent vegetative state? What if somebody is very, very cognitively impaired? Are you going to start counting all of those people as dead? There's a need. We talked about this need, but it's an artificially created shortage, right, by this whole transplant enterprise. What if we start to look at more and more people with these greedy eyes of the wolf in our pursuit of gaining more organs? These were fears that were voiced everywhere. It was not a civilizational clash. That's point number one. Point number two is that the rhetoric of the Egyptian physicians, some of them, there's a small lobby group, and they would go up every time there was a proposal sent before the Congress, they would say, stop, you're committing a grave sin. This is very anti-Sharia because you're going to exploit and you're going to murder, and they made a big deal about this. And what they would say was, they in the West, they don't care about the soul, we care about the soul. And the soul is still there, and you're gonna go and take out a heart while the soul is still there? Haram, haram, haram. Okay, but you know what happens in Euro-America? It's not that they don't care about the soul, because it's easy to think they don't have morals and we have morals. I mean, I think we all live in a moral community where we strive for some of the same things. And among Euro-American clinicians, what social scientists have found is that when they interviewed them, they said, to the nurses, to the ICU staff, to the ICU physicians, do you believe these patients on respirators are biologically alive? And they would say, well, yes, which is the same argument that the Egyptian physicians are using. In fact, the Egyptian physicians are relying on Euro-American medical journals that are talking about fevers in the brain stem, that are talking about having to give them pain relief and anesthesia during the procurement. They say, how can someone who's dead have a fever? Why would you need painkiller if you have to take? Well, the Euro-American clinicians had a different understanding of the soul. And in their view, the person or the soul had already gone. And this was just a body that was being artificially grown. Because they have that capacity of separating person from body. And some people link this back to the 17th century philosopher René Descartes, the Cartesian mind-body split. In the Eastern countries, you find that any movement, any biological breath, even if it's dependent on the machine, is seen as evidence that the soul is there to animate the body. My argument about all of this is biomedicine does not take the soul as a legitimate status of inquiry. Biomedicine does not teach its medical residents about the soul, about where it is, about when it goes, about where it's located, whether it's in the brain, whether it's in the heart. So you cannot say that the Egyptian or the Japanese view is less scientific than the North American view, because the soul is outside of the purview of biomedical science. What we have is different understandings of the relationship between soul and body. Okay. Well, and I'll just say one more thing about that, which is that I also think it's a different question to ask. I don't want to come off like I'm sounding anti-organ transplantation. I think it's a procedure that can help a lot of people. But what I do have a problem with is the different framings of the question. So I think it's a different question if somebody said to the ethicists, these people have very, very, very poor quality of life. In any case, we can't talk about the soul because we don't know. Maybe the soul, only God knows about it. But this person, there is no chance of recovery. This person is irreversibly brain loss function. Is it okay? Then you can have a conversation. Can you take an organ? But to insist this person is dead, this person isn't dead, this person's soul is, we don't know these things. right? It's about whether we can frame. And that was the problem, was that the framing was off. Instead of asking that legitimate question, can you offer these people potential lives and sacrifice these lives? That's the honest question to ask. But to say, no, this person's really dead, no, the soul is gone, we don't know where the soul is. So I don't think that was a fair way to answer the question. Okay, I'm going to skip this stuff about the eyes because it's too much. But I'll go straight into kidney donation. The other thing about kidney donation is that there's so many social entanglements. So some people have said it's the most social of all medical procedures because you're actually relying on a very big sacrifice from another living person. And what I found in the Egyptian case is that depending on who the kin were, depending on how you were related to people within your family, people would have very different views on whether transplantation was okay or not. So for example, if the person who was willing and able and medically able to give a kidney was the mother or the father, nobody had a problem with this. Nobody. It was like, subhanAllah, God gives us so much extra function. God gave this mother the ability to save her child. Of course, she wants nothing more than to save her child, or the father wants nothing more than to save his child. People did not have an ethical issue with that particular relationship. And in fact, when Sheikh al-Sha'rawi had said, oh, who are you to give your body? There were journalists who went and they said, are you saying a mother should give to her son? He said, no. He didn't want to engage in that question. He was just so absolutist. And that's what made him very upset. That's what got people very upset, was that he wasn't flexible to the different conditions. Because one finds that depending on the different cases, people have very different reactions and they'll understand the situation differently. But when you have one very solid absolutist stance, it's not helpful. And so the parent to the child was never a problem in all of the cases that I saw. The problem came when the parent was medically ineligible to give a kidney. That was when the problem came. The parents often would do anything. The parents who were very religious and very pious, and they knew deep inside that it's haram to buy a kidney from somebody, they would do anything to save their child. They say, God forgive me, I love my child so much. If it was a wife to a husband, oftentimes you see that direction. Very few do you see the other direction, where the husband gives to the wife. What about that? You can see brothers to brothers more often than you see brother to sister. You see sister to brother more often than you see brother to sister. There were different patterns that went on. But the thing that began to worry people, and here's, I always like to give the positive after the negative. So I was very upset during my research when I found wife after wife being divorced for having kidney failure and being on dialysis. And I said, so where are the fatwas on this? Because if we want to just take the Islamic legal approach and just say, oh, we want to know what Islam says about XYZ, let's go look in the fatwas. Well, fatwas are only responses to the questions you get. There's only certain people asking certain questions. What about the things that aren't being asked? Why isn't anybody upset over this? This is clearly unethical, to leave your most vulnerable family member because you don't want to pay for the costs of treatment. Where's the outrage over that? Well, here is an example of a husband who very much wanted to give his kidney to his wife, but he was incompatible match. And she said, no, I will never take from you. The body belongs to God. I often say that. And here's a nurse bonding with a patient. This is actually a Christian patient in Egypt. Many of them had the exact same answers, the same ways to formulate the position, but he was very lucky that his mother was able to give him a kidney. Now, the other thing that worried people, and this is something that I say when we talk about what is Islamic bioethics, what does Islam say about this particular position? We often don't think, well, you have to go into the disease itself. What's causing it? We need epidemiology, we need toxicology, we need cellular pathology, we need social science, we need political science, we need anthropologists, we need a multidimensional approach to understand this question because it's a very, very complicated question that integrates with everything. And how to ask a patient, how do you think you got kidney failure? You find that the answer to that question tells you a lot about that person's position on a technology like transplantation. Many patients in Egypt had what I call political etiologies, meaning they believed that the reason that they were sick was because of political mismanagement of resources. And in fact, one finds that there are entire villages in the Delta region of Egypt where pesticide and chemical companies are dumping their waste into the agricultural water, and you find very high proportions of kidney and liver failure. You have very high proportions of hypertension, high proportions of diabetes, I know also in the Gulf. And depending on people's lifestyle, on their understanding about, are we all as a society vulnerable to something that's going to happen? If we are all as a society vulnerable to kidney disease, how does it make sense to take a kidney from my brother? I'm going to leave him in the same environment that made me sick when I had 2 kidneys. I'm going to leave him with 1 kidney. These were the local understandings of the patients that later get actually backed up by science. When the science and the toxicology reports finally come out and the epidemiologies looking at these questions, they find that there's reason for the patients to have been voicing this issue. There's a very different issue than in Euro-America where it's seen as an individual issue. This person has kidney failure, this person doesn't. Let's take from the healthy and give to the unhealthy. What if you're all seen as on a scale heading toward kidney pathology, kidney vulnerability? Then you're less likely to want to look inside the family for a transplant. This is a very old data set, 1998. And in 2001, they stopped doing these kinds of renal failure. I have a more recent 2012 epidemiology of end-stage renal disease in the Arab world and the Gulf. And basically the conclusion over and over again is we need more studies. We need more studies. There's so much kidney failure that's going undiagnosed that we don't know about. There's kidney disease-related deaths that we don't know about. It's very hard to trace the etiology, but I just bring this slide to show you the highest percentage is unknown. And when the patients are being told over and again, we don't know, we don't know, we don't know, they have reason to worry about this idea of taking from within the family. Ad-daght is a word for stress or pressure in the Arabic language, but it's also the medical term used for hypertension. And people would link the stress that I'm going, the stress of everyday living, the stress of salaries falling and rents skyrocketing, and the price of food skyrocketing, and the crowd, and the traffic, and the pollution. We can list all of the stresses. And they relate the stress of everyday life to notions of vulnerability. And the idea is that when you have these social determinants of health making people bodily vulnerable, a very end-stage, high-cost technological intervention like organ transplantation can never solve such a widespread problem. You're asking for the impossible. Water shortages in situations of very high heat, high temperatures. Water shortages and water quality are a very big concern. And we know that in Egypt, part of the discourse about eyes and the importance of having qaranaya is because there were high rates of trachoma in the Arab region for a very long time. And if gone untreated, that could lead to corneal opacity. Well, in terms of kidney and liver disease, there was the endemic parasite, the schistosome, that's nail transmitted from the Nile. That, it leads to kidney infection that doesn't usually single-handedly cause kidney failure, but it's an assault on the kidney. And in the early 70s, late 1969, 70, 71, Nasser had this very kind of ambitious program of doing everything statewide, scaling up. And so after the construction of the high dam, what happened is that the water tables rose and water was stagnant and weeds were flourishing. And farmers had to depend now on chemical fertilizers because the rich Nile silt was not flowing in the Nile as it had. So now you have a much higher dependence on chemical fertilizer and much higher rates of schistosomes in the water that are blooming in the stagnant and in these sort of places where, because of the rising of the dam, it was conducive to much higher rates. In some cases, it would triple in the village. And so this kind of scaling up high ambition program led by Nasser was to have people go door to door in all the villages and give them preventative therapy against schistosomiasis, perinatal through the needle. This was before hepatitis C was isolated as a virus, before people knew that hepatitis C was a heat-stable virus that survived the attempts of boiling, of sterilization by boiling of needles. Inadvertently, they transmitted, it is the largest epidemic, man-made iatrogenic epidemic in world history. And 10 to 30% of Egyptian villagers now have HCV. This is a viral time bomb. Now we're 40 years after the initial insult. Imagine the numbers of liver failure, liver cancers that you're going to eventually see. Will there ever, ever, ever in the world be enough liver lobes to transplant to solve an epidemic? No. Okay. So what do we take away from all of this? Is that there's so much going on in this question that when we ask what does Islam say about organ transplantation, we make it seem as if Islam is just one thing or one voice, or as if we had one Quranic text that was clear on organ transplantation. Of course we don't. It depends on all of these multiple factors, and these factors are always changing, and they're context dependent, depending geographically on the region, depending socially on the issue, depending on the family dynamic, depending on the disease that we're talking about. All of these factors have to be taken into consideration. And Islam actually has a very rich ethical tradition of adjusting and being flexible to the conditions. There are some legal tools that people have used, like maslaha and darura, to be able to fit to these accommodating needs. But the imposition of these sort of codified public policy, static laws is asking us to misfit something very complicated and flexible. We're asking something static to explain all of that, and it doesn't work. We have to have a much more flexible understanding of what the ethical problems are. We have to attend to things like the social determinants of health, like social rights for people, education, access to water, access to primary care so that people's kidney function can be monitored before it gets to kidney failure. These have to be part of any program of transplantation. That's sort of my recommendations at the end of all of this research. In the end, when we ask people, oh, just do a donor card and check, it's as if we're acting like each people, we're autonomous units, we're not interconnected to one another. When I go to check my donor card in the US, when I get my driver's license when I was 18, that's supposed to tell me 30 years later what I'm supposed to think, even if 30 years later I might have very different views, I might have had different experiences, I might have suffer different traumas. We have to think about the temporal scale and the scale of the individual. Are we only going to look at an individual, or are we going to look at a social? Even if we look at the individual, are we going to look at the different body parts in different ways? Are we going to take a longitudinal scale idea of what's going to happen? We have to think about science and religion as dynamic social processes. And I just want to say Sheikh Sharawi, with all of my ihtiram lo, if his concern, and he said this was his concern, was that people would forget God, or if his concern was that we wouldn't be grateful enough or humble enough to the Creator, if we just relied on technology and we didn't have that ta'addub fil abudiyya, that's what he would talk about. We had to sort of cultivate a disposition of worship and humility before the Creator. So what the Creator gives us is good, alhamdulillah. What the Creator tries us with is good. That was what his general message was. But he's not giving us enough faith. He's not, allowing for the possibility where somebody like this guy, Khaled, who received a transplant from his father and was now able to have a twin boy and girl after the operation. That he and his father were crying tears of happiness when the surgery was a success. His father was initially deemed ineligible to be a donor and then worked very hard to get his hypertension level and his sugar level right so that he could transplant. And in the end, they're so grateful to God. Their piety is enhanced. So Sharawi didn't give us enough credit as Muslims, I think, to realize that even with the technology, we can still be humble, we can still be grateful, we can still have a strong relationship, just like with all technological modifications that we later incorporate into our lives. So both the secularists of the world who said as technology advances, people will forget religion, they were wrong. And the worried religious people who said as technology advances, we'll forget religion, they were wrong. Technology has very different consequences. We have to be aware of what all of those social consequences are. And sometimes out of suffering comes times of solidarity, like the patients that I found in the dialysis ward. And in the end, they were grateful that they belonged to God, as they would say. This was a way also of coming to terms with something that they knew that it wasn't in their hands to change. So I'm going to end there and just say that I dedicate this lecture to my friend Virgil Perez, whose sister's in the audience.
For me, at least, your lecture summarizes the problem of legislation. There's nothing in the world which is right absolutely or wrong absolutely.
I can't hear. There's
nothing in the world that we knew about in the world.
In the world.
In the world, okay. That is right absolutely or wrong absolutely. And I'm an engineer, and I've worked in telecommunication for 15 years. And I've heard people saying internet is a completely, if I use the Islamic word, haram sometimes. And this takes us to the problem of legislation in the Arab world, or the worlds who are still not able to develop a well, or let's say a more efficient legislation system, whereby issues are not discussed in the right manner, expertise are not having the right to make or contribute in the decision making, and I'm talking here about parliaments. Any legislation comes out from a parliament, and if you have a parliament that is not, let's say, scientifically built, this will lead you into wrong legislations. And in Islamic countries, we tend to take fatwa, and fatwa is not coming from an expert. It's never an expertise. It's somebody who has a view because of a certain approach into things. It may be right, may be wrong. Maybe somewhere in the mid. So legislation efficiency is the problem.
But I also gave the example of the physicians who were the experts, and they also disagreed. So we can't only always, wait, Nils, he wants the mic back. Give Shadi the mic back. So it's not always just a problem.
It goes against the same issue. There's nothing in the world which is 100% wrong or 100% right. Nothing in the world. Nothing, I would claim. If you look at internet when it started, everybody says it's a wrong tool. Look at it now.
Yeah.
Internet is like electricity. You cannot live without it. At least for, like, I would say 50% of the living population. And in 10 years, we claim as telecommunication expertise, it's going to be somehow the way education is going. People is going to learn via internet. If everybody is saying we are not able to transfer knowledge everywhere, in Egypt we cannot educate people, internet is going to be the solution, and telecommunication is going to be the solution. But look at it when it started in the 97, 98. People were saying it's not right, it's not good, it transfers everything bad. Well, no, it's not everything bad. Everything in life has an advantage and a disadvantage. And legislation is the thing that makes us able to take the good thing and leave the bad thing. That's the community decision. Find out what's bad, put legislation to minimize it. Find out what's good, put legislation to maximize it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, so I hear you saying that nothing comes without risks and benefits. So my intervention is to say, yes, but, yes, and. We also have to pay attention to who gets to define the risk and benefit. So we have to look at all different levels of the population to get at that question. We can't only look at, the Euro-American, middle-class, privileged, geographically specific location and then apply that to the world. We have to study in each instance what the risk and benefits are. Thank you.
Actually, I have a comment and a question to ask. The first comment is just to the gentleman who just spoke. You and I may agree that there is nothing that is absolutely right and absolutely wrong, but there are people who do believe this. And taking the example of electricity, the Amish people in America absolutely believe that electricity is wrong. They will not use it because of that. And I think that's what causes problems, is that there are the problem is that there are these belief systems that everyone does not share. And yet they do, they exist, and that I think is a real impediment to understanding between people and progress, and if you want to call it that, in our society. Now, the question I'd like to ask is, what is the Islamic stand? Like this woman who is hoping for a regenerated kidney to come out of stem cell research, does she really understand where this what stem cell research is, where this regeneration would come from, and therefore, if she really understood as an Islamic person, would she still eventually reject that? Because isn't stem cell research haram in Islam as it is to fundamentalist Christians?
Well, thanks for that question. So first, I'll just say about your comment, you raised the point that not everybody will evaluate risks and benefits in the exact same way. So that's yet another reason why we have to have anthropological and social science research and very fine-grained analysis to get at that. And in terms of stem cell, most Muslim countries and most religious scholars have said it's fine because the embryo doesn't have a soul until, depending on some positions, either 40th day or 120th day. So because it happens very early, it's not seen as ensouled, and because it's for the benefit of caring and could help all of these people with diseases, it has been given the okay for the most part. So it's very different. So that's an example of different risk and benefit analysis from the fundamentalist Christians versus the Muslim scholars.
You mentioned that we cannot say the Japanese or Egyptians are less scientific because science is silent on the question of soul.
Yeah.
But I think most scientists, when they work, they assume the soul doesn't exist.
Does not exist.
Does not exist. Because if they do, I wonder why they do not do any research on the soul if they believe the soul has some functioning in the human body. So
well,
I think they're less scientific.
Well, so there are social science studies done on physicians in America, and I can tell you that the majority of physicians in America do believe in a creator and in a soul. So that's what they tell us. But how does that influence directly their research, I think, is unknown at this point.
Yeah, first of all, Sherine, I would like to say that you've given a real good presentation, and we can give a good clap to her, yeah?
Thank you.
Well, thanks. I'm Vinod. I'm basically from India, and I have taken a keen interest into this subject because I'm a practical person who has gone through all these challenges. Way back 2003, my wife has been diagnosed with this kidney problem, and she was on a dialysis for more than 6 months. And after that, the same what you said, the religious problem has come, and our family and our relatives and all this started saying that how and why somebody should give the kidney. And I was like, I have got 2 daughters by that time. So I was, shocked because my family was like in trouble. Anyway, but I'm really thankful to my mother-in-law who didn't listen at all anything, and she went to the doctor and she said that I will donate the kidney. And things went well. Yeah, her mother has given the kidney, and 2004 she has been transplanted well. And after that time, she's under the immunosuppression drugs. And today, by the grace of God and everything, we are doing well. She's really doing good.
It's good to hear. Thank you.
So what are your expert comments about the India, because you told about Islamic and all. What do you think about the Indian view from your perspective?
Well, so India is another country that's had, I think, probably more logistically and practical problems with the cadaveric procurement. It's very hard to, network with all the different hospitals in the same region to, if one patient dies, to get the organs in time to another place. So a lot of countries have had difficulty. India is yet another case, like Egypt, like Mexico, like Philippines, like Pakistan, where the supply of organs in the form of willing sellers is more than the need. The problem then becomes, does one regulate that, as in the case of Iran? Does one criminalize it with the risk of it going further underground? How does one deal with that problem? There are entire villages in India, in Pakistan, in the Philippines, where people are called one kidneys, and they have the scars to show you. Often in the case of India, we find a lot of kidney selling related to dowries that they have to come by to pay for the daughter to get married. Sometimes the wife sells a kidney to get addicted or alcoholic husband out of debt. It's a very dire situation, and I think that the fault isn't with organ transplantation itself. I think the fault is with these larger structural inequalities, and organ transplantation comes and can exacerbate that social inequality. So what do we do as people? We fight for social justice. We work for labor rights. We try to get people primary health care and safe living conditions, and work for better gender relations within the family. There's a lot of things we can do.
Good evening, and thank you again for your very interesting presentation.
Thank you.
I am Mirella El-Kadi, Assistant Professor of Chemistry at the Petroleum Institute in Abu Dhabi. Actually, this is another great topic where you can have different reactions for different cases in different contexts. At the same time, it's very easy to come up with theories as long as you are not yourself affected or somebody from your family or close family in this problem. Now, my question is the following. During your research period, have you ever met somebody who was 100% against the idea of transplantation and suddenly became a patient who needs this transplantation?
Yes.
And could you please tell us what was her or his opinion?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So in my book, I talk about one patient I named Ali. And he was somebody who identified very strongly with the Muslim or Islamist movement, critical of the government. He kind of sort of self-styled himself as having a beard and a zabiba and was very critical. And I grew very fond of Ali because he's had a wonderful sense of humor, and he had us all laughing in the dialysis clinic, even though it was a very hard place to be in. And he had a wife and 2 children, 2 small children. And he would say, haram, 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 haram. Absolutely, he absolutely was so rigid about that. And every time I would go meet him, he would give me so many reasons why. And I would say, but what if, what if, what if? So we would have this back and forth. And he would say, God is the one who created organs. God is the one who takes and gives. And I say, yeah, and God gave your wife the possibility to give to you, and she's offering you. And every day she's begging you, Ali, accept her kidney. Why do you not also see that as karam, as generosity of God? And he would say, absolutely not. As I knew him over months, I learned that he was very, very worried about his young wife. She was very young. And he was worried that she would soon be widowed. Whether he got a transplant or not, he didn't see it as a cure. He saw it as a way to live a little bit longer, but he saw his death soon. And he was very worried to leave a widow behind taking care of the children. And what would have been so perfect in that scenario, and I was talking about the family relationships, was if he had a parent to give him a kidney. His mother was deceased, and his father just never offered, and everybody was afraid to ask. He had brothers and sisters offering, but the problem is that people worry, if I take from my brother, what about my brother's wife and the children? Will they resent me? There's a big worry about taking from siblings because it's seen that the sibling's immediate family has more rights over that person, and then you would be responsible if that person falls ill. And I saw cases like that where a younger brother, he was a teacher, gave a kidney to his older brother. He said, I'm nothing, I'm just a teacher, but my brother's a doctor. He understood these things, I want to give to him. And 9 years later, and after 3 years, the brother who received the kidney died. And 9 years later, the one who gave fell into kidney failure and had nobody to give to him. So it was and these are all stories that are circulating in the units. Everybody's seeing these stories. So what happened with Ali is, every day I would come and he would be 100% no, and he'd give me Quran, and he'd give me a hadith, and he'd give everything. And I said, what about the shuyukh on TV last night? Malish da'wa bihum. I don't trust those shuyukh. Where do they get their information? He was adamant. One day, I went to the clinic, and he said, did you hear the news? I'm getting a transplant. And I said, what happened? And he was so happy and excited, and what happened was that he had gone to Cairo. He worked for the army for a little bit. And the people in Egypt who have worked in the army have access to military hospitals, which are much better hospitals than what the poor have in the rural conditions. And he had gone and he saw that the doctor in charge of the hospital was himself a transplant recipient. He had gone to America and gotten the kidney from his wife. He was great. He saw people with his own eyes in the hospital who were transplant recipients who were doing well. And they promised him that he would have something like that. And he suddenly had this great sort of surge of hope that maybe there was a solution. And then I think, so he agreed finally. His wife had been for years, please, Ali, please, take my kidney. Finally, he agreed to do the analysis. So I think a week or 2 weeks later, I went, and he was very, very, very depressed. The analysis came. There was no match, no tissue match, and all of his hopes were shot. And I think there was something about going back to his rural setting. It was a very poor setting, feeling the hopelessness again, and then we just went back to all the same Quranic reasons for why. And so I think that there's a tendency, particularly in the Euro-American social sciences, to see that case and say, oh, these people are so hypocritical. Yeah, they get religion when it suits them, and then religion when it's... And I think, no, that's a wrong understanding of religion. I think actually that what he understands about religion is that that he can understand his relationship to God no matter what circumstance God gives him. So when there was no chance for a transplant, he thanked God for preventing him from something potentially haram. When he had a chance for a transplant, he thanked God for the opportunity that maybe he could get out of it. When he didn't have a transplant, he went back to thanking God. And I think that that was the role religion had. It wasn't this sort of hypocritical or manipulation or rationalization of religion like we tend to think. I think that it was something that sort of gave him the strength and the fortitude to come back every day.
You mentioned sort of in passing that women were more often givers than men, and throughout your presentation you tried to detangle what seemed like sort of obvious stereotypes. So I was wondering if you could offer us more insight into that, into those relationships. Is it just what we should assume that men are sexist and women are generous, or is there more complexity to that issue?
I mean, I think that, first of all, it's a global phenomenon. So I will say that. It's not a Middle East specific phenomenon, that the flow of organs goes from women to men, and from brown and black to white bodies, and from poor bodies to rich bodies. So to put it very crudely, there's a pattern. I mean, I think in the Egyptian case, what people understood was that the man was the breadwinner, and he was the one who was supporting the family, and the women's contribution was bodily or reproductive or domestic. And so because of that kind of gender division of labor, that's why we see that particular pattern. And you can see it in other kinds of cases too. Like, for example, there were two discourses that were simultaneous. One was, in this situation where somebody is dying, or a lot of resources are going to save this one person, the resources should flow from the weakest to the strongest, so that the strongest can protect us all. So for example, there was a case of a woman who, it was a very sad story. So she had eclampsia after her pregnancy and fell into kidney failure. And she was an orphan, and her husband was an orphan. And he was spending all of his money, all of his care on his wife, trying everything, single-handedly raising the child because she was unable to raise it. She was very sick. And he was also caring for her mentally disabled brother, okay? So in the village, it's a poor village, and people are, a little bit harsh, and they have harsh realities, and they get tough to deal with those harsh realities. So in the village community, people would say, your brother-in-law is not using his kidney in anything, take it from him. Give it to the wife and solve your family's problem. What do they mean by he's not contributing, he's not using his kidney? They mean he's not contributing financially. He's financially a burden on the society, he can't work. People have to care for him. So let's use his kidney and make the family stronger. The counter discourse was, in Islam, we're all stand before God. God will judge us on our deeds and on what we did, not on what capabilities God gave us. And of course you can't take and give what God gave, especially if you can't take advantage of the cognitively impaired. So the husband was like, there's no way I can do that. And to satisfy the neighbors, well, why don't you care about your wife? He actually went to an office and sent a fax to Dar al-Ifta in Cairo and said, this is my situation, can I take from the mentally disabled brother? And they responded right away, and they said, well, if he's cognitively if he's cognitively able to understand the situation and give consent, then yes. If he can't, then no. And the situation was he couldn't. So he knew, and he wanted to kind of have that confirmation. So there's a discourse of like resources should go from the most vulnerable to the stronger, so the strong can provide for us, in the case of women to men, and then the counter discourse of haram, you're exploiting the weak. And those two lived simultaneously.
One of my relative, old woman, she was in need to kidney. Her sons and girls want to offer it to her, but said, I am an old woman and I didn't hurt you. So she died without
Yes.
take it from them. Another point, that since the Islam come to the welfare of the human being, and since the transplantation is for the welfare for the human being, so I see that it is good for the transplantation, and there is no need to take a fatwa. Take the fatwa from me now that it is good for anything, because I want to say to you that the fatwa or the mufti must be specialized in the mufti must be one for the medicine, one for the economic, one for the other things. A specialized mufti. This is the point. Not mufti for all the things, because maybe he don't know he is not specialized in the economic, and they ask him about the economic and bank and other things. Thank you.
Thank you. So you've raised a number of points, and I'll address them. The first is that what you just mentioned as a case is exactly the pattern that I found, was that people were very willing to give from parents to children, but not the other direction. People are very unwilling to accept kidneys from their adult children. And what's interesting, I talked about that ever-widening demand for transplantation in Europe and America as transplantation becomes more successful. In the US, what they found as a trend now is that even granddaughters and grandsons are donating kidneys to their grandparents, because the discourse isn't this person is aging and this is a part of life, but it's this person has something and you can give him the miracle of life. And they think, well, how can I not, to my grandfather? So there's strange things happening all around the world in that regard. And the second thing, what you raise, is absolutely something that we see in history, which is that in all religious communities, this includes the Jewish communities and the Muslim communities, the religious leader, in the case of the Jews, the rabbi, and in our case, either the mufti or the qadi, was, in historical times, the most learned person in all the fields, was the literate person. And so people would go and ask many questions of many disciplines. And now we have specialization in many different fields, and many of the religious scholars, I'll say many ulama, recognize this, and they come up with councils where they ask for input from many disciplines. So that is recognized, and I think people have been addressing that.
Maybe you can just clarify something for me. There seems to be an inconsistency with, you say, how can you take what God gave you the body, how can you take from it? Does that extend to the environment? And my point being, say, if you drive a car, you could indirectly be affecting human, cause respiratory illness, so
you could do what?
You could cause respiratory problems, indirectly over the long term.
Right.
So my question is,
right,
how do you reconcile that sort of?
No, that's a very good question, and that's why what I said was that statement, the body belongs to God, was not clear in and of itself to make any kind of argument. It was something that was flexible enough for all kinds of people to take it up and repeat it. But people often meant very different things every time they said it. They were re-signifying it. So if you were just saying, well, God gave you this, well then, how could we do anything? How could we plant? How could we irrigate? How could we eat? Everything has benefits and risks, like Shadi said. So yeah, that statement was not clear at all. It's not, theologically, it's not a novel statement. It's just commonsensical. And practically, it has no use, I would say. It's just much too vague. So really, what I'm saying is that was kind of the genius of Sha'rawi, was he spoke in these very sort of elaborate, evocative ways, and people would grab on, and they would articulate a whole host of different issues. Sometimes they were articulating, I don't want to leave my wife dead and a widow with young children to raise without me providing for her. Sometimes what they meant was, you government who are corrupt, who are putting me in this public hospital, who might desecrate my body, do not have the right to my family's bodies. The bodies belong to God. Sometimes what they were saying was, we don't know what the outcome of the transplant is. It's all in the hands of God. So with each iteration, somebody often meant something different. It was vague in its own terms, doesn't affect anything specific, but it was evocative, and it captured a lot of misgivings that people had for many different reasons. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming.